No one spoke. Not a single soul dared to interrupt collective shock that had fallen upon this hall of magical elites. For the first time in what felt like forever, true, genuine silence actually dawned upon this otherwise ceaselessly chatty crowd. A crowd that found it possible to talk over anything, even the arrival of a dragon following an earth-shattering explosion. This made their stares all the more palpable, as each and every pair of eyes, round, slitted and otherwise, all locked on with expressions as diverse and dynamic as the number of species present within the room. Shock and disbelief was the most common amongst them. This was followed up closely by confusion and disbelief, then intrigue, and even fear and concern amongst a rare few. To my right was Thasia's look of anxious worry, and to my left was Thalman's excitable gaze, only tempered by his otherwise cool expression. To my far left was Eleanor, who looked like he'd just checked out of reality, with that deer-in-headlights expression still holding strong. Though there was something else to that gaze, as it zeroed in on my card, as if out of some sense of doubt and worry. To my front was Quiv, whose eyes never once landed on me, but solely and possessively on that shiny object of interest held tightly between my fingers. The professors on stage fared no better, with Chiska being the most animated out of all of them, her feline eyes all but dilated, like a domestic cat having caught sight of a particularly elusive prey. Though amongst all of these, it was the Dean who was the most interesting to read, as his previously warm and condescending expressions quickly shifted to a placid, tempered one. One that was otherwise decidedly calm, if not for those two eyes that pierced straight through my very soul. Two eyes that seemed to not so subtly say, "Stop," just short of verbally demanding it. It was then that I realized I had a call to make on just how far I wanted to take this, and whether or not I wanted to seize this opportunity for what it could easily become. This mission was about conducting diplomacy, as much as it was about fulfilling, attending, and observing my role as Earthrealm's candidate in the eyes of the Academy. It was clear, however, that seizing this opportunity would be one of those instances where the aims of these two roles would be far from mutual alignment, perhaps even drifting into the territory of conflicting interests. But this wasn't anything new. In fact, it wasn't as if I hadn't already tested my limits of my role as a candidate. The first few hours following my arrival at the Academy was a testament to this, given the awkward position the binding ritual had placed me in. As a candidate, I was obliged to follow through with all of the oaths and pledges. As a representative, I was obliged to reject any oaths or pledges to a foreign power. What's more, as a representative, I was obliged to make it clear what my presence here meant, so that no one could misconstrue silence with acquiescence. But that situation was fundamentally different from this. This time I wasn't just responding or reacting. This time I was taking the initiative. Because unlike the binding ceremony, this situation wasn't instigated by any within the Academy's ranks. It was instead initiated by me, out of chance and on the spot, the latter spontaneity being something completely unagreeable to Nexian sensibilities. The path to diplomacy, to political maneuvering and posturing, wasn't always clear-cut. In fact, it was rarely ever straightforward. This wasn't a pre-planned course, or a strictly choreographed itinerary. It was subjective, and up to the whims of social context, which could easily be upended by so many independent variables, dictated by an innumerable quantity of independent actors, all with their own aims and goals. To wait for your turn in such a setting would be as good as allowing yourself to be trampled over. It was as good as giving up and packing your bags home. Diplomacy, at least in a setting as competitively aggressive as this, with draconian rules that lacked the systematic nuance of the UN's boringly legislated state protocols, demanded a more opportunistic and aggressive mindset. This definitely fit that bill. What's more, it was the perfect opportunity to finally clear up the air, because it marked the first instance that I could finally dictate the course of my own narrative, without it being part of some pre-planned Nexian scheme. It was a chance to finally make humanity's position known to an audience of hundreds. Hundreds of elites belonging to 100 different governments scattered across 100 different worlds, all of them as young and as impressionable as me. It was time to seize the opportunity and just run with it. Starting with something the Nexus seemed overly fond of: showmanship. I'm assuming that this... I paused as quickly as I begun, running the card between my fingers in a fluid, practiced motion. All those hours of pen-spinning tricks finally paid off, as I saw Quiv and a good chunk of the student body training their eyes to match the movements of the card. Is the grand artifact you were talking about, sir? I allowed my vocoded voice to echo throughout the room, much in the same way the Dean's voice had done before. The acoustic properties of the room worked both ways, and where magic had helped the Dean to project his voice, I had my trusty amplifiers to more or less do the same. Now, I'm not much for boasting, nor am I a proponent for the reductive tendencies of ascribing the cumulative worth of a person to a material object. But when the veracity of my honour and integrity comes into question, I find that the best means of addressing doubt and lingering concern is to nip the misconceptions at the bud. That being said, I would like to set the record straight. I would like to make it known to all that Earthrealm's first representative does indeed fall into the circle of the privileged few who possesses such an artifact, and by that same reasoning possesses the badge of honour, virtue, and integrity in accordance with the library's selective scrutiny. I parroted the Dean's own words, not directly back towards him, but towards the room as a whole, triggering the man's gaze to shift from that of a strong insistence to an outright look of seething indignancy. I would also like to make it known that this was accomplished not within a lifespan or a career, but a matter of days upon my arrival. This fact seemed to be enough to send a good half of my captive audience into a catatonic spiral of pupillary dilation. Earthrealm's intentions has been, and always continues to be, one of friendly diplomatic outreach. Our goal when breaching the void between spaces was always fueled by peaceful intent, and driven by the tenets of discovery and exploration. We sought out new worlds with hopes of discovering intelligent life amongst the breadth of infinity. We reached through the void between spaces with open minds and measured hearts. We did this all with the intent of peaceful and constructive contact in mind. My presence here, and my candidacy at the Academy, represents humanity's first achievement in those steps towards peaceful coexistence. My procurement of this card represents humanity's second achievement in this aim. I paused, taking a breath as I allowed my point to be made. During this, I noted that Thacia and several other students' eyes looked on, no longer with shock or concern, but with a knowing gaze as if they were predicting the trajectory of this speech. For this marks the beginnings of the start to a peaceful, constructive dialogue between Earthrealm and a second, neutral entity. I let out a small exhale, before transitioning quickly into my final points. And if I were to be so brazen, I'd honestly say that this is only just the beginning. The beginning of a long unending tradition where multilateral dialogue paves the way for a lasting peace between civilized peoples. Suffice it to say, Earthrealm is here to talk, and is willing to talk, on equal and respectful ground. I made it clear what I meant by that, by craning my head to meet not the Dean, but the students themselves. The students, who, as I noticed last night, were clearly not all at the top of the pecking order, which meant my hearts and minds brand of diplomacy might be able to crack through with some of them, if Sorosar and Lariel were any indication of what was possible, at least. I didn't know what to expect by the end of that speech. I definitely knew it wasn't going to be an uproarious round of applause. I knew this wasn't that sort of story. I knew I wasn't in some sort of a feel-good fantasy drama, where all it took to change the world was one simple speech. But that wasn't the reason why I gave this speech in the first place. I did this to prove a point, to make a statement, to demonstrate that humanity was a player, not a pawn. So when a small, loud, and purposefully slow series of claps came to quickly break the silence, almost immediately after my speech, I was at first confused. Though that confusion certainly didn't last, as a vaguely familiar voice soon made itself known. A voice which the EV instantly brought up on my HUD. Speaker IFF confirmed. A43 Oris Ping. Pranathia Realm. Neutral. Professor Atalan Rorastor, may I invoke the compromise of the Protector in order to retake the floor on your behalf? The large, hulking bull suddenly spoke. He didn't direct his words towards me, but instead to the Dean on stage. As the master of this floor, you may, Lord Oris Ping. The Dean spoke sternly, giving the bull a nod as he now directed his attention squarely on me. Civilized people do not overstay their welcome in forms of public speech, Cadet Emma Booker. Perhaps you should have spent more time acquainting yourself on the principles of decorum, rather than on perfecting the art of Hynexian, as your efforts in studying this resplendent tongue are all but squandered, if not entirely made pointless, when put to use in these long-winded self-serving monologues of blasphemous dissonance, the bull began, immediately pulling out all the stops as he'd done before against the likes of Quiv during the whole explosion incident. The latter now watching in heightened interest from the front row. What are you getting at with, civilized peoples do not speak when their betters are speaking to them, and it is becoming clear to me that a civilized person you aren't, Cadet Emma Booker. The bull began taking firm, resonant steps, walking up from one of the middle rows all the way up to where I stood in the back row. Which leads me to believe, Cadet Emma Booker, that you are bluffing. I blinked rapidly in response, only to reply simply, about what? This. Oris pointed accusingly towards the card still in my hands. You know something about the library incident, don't you? I mean, it should be quite obvious, is it not? He turned to the crowd of students, not once making eye contact or turning to the professors, making it clear that this was between him, myself, and the rest of the students present. You, a New Realmer, waltzing around, hiding in plain sight, masking your mana field in a suit of armor, like some sort of a walking brazen declaration of defiance in the name of the Nexus? Who else could have been responsible for the malicious affronts committed against the library? And why else would you, out of everyone here, be so eager to quickly cement yourself as innocent, using this so-called evidence to cement your alibi before anyone else has a chance, prior to tomorrow's investigation, no less? The bull glared at me with what I could only describe as a gotcha grin, fulfilling the Dean's prophecy of being one of those students that fancies themselves the over-analytical sort. In following extremes, I have reason to believe that the supposed card you hold, in between your primitive fingers, to be nothing but a forgery. A carefully constructed component of this haphazardly planned bluff. The bull pushed on, before entering what I could only describe as an Eleanor-grade death spiral, as that internal narrative started to take over their reasoning. Because the alternative to that truth is to assume that the library of all entities has indeed deemed it fit to bestow upon you a mark of patronage. You, a backwater New Realmer of all people. he scoffed, letting out an indignant huff in the process. The content of your character is already suspect enough. However, to assume that you have something to trade, something to offer, something to provide the library that would somehow grant you a gold card of all things, is absurd. For what could a new realmer offer that a fully actualized adjacent realmer, let alone a Nexian, could not? The question hung in the air for a few tentative seconds, and in those seconds the same silence continued to dominate without reprieve. Admit it. You have nothing of value to offer the library, Cadet Emma Booker. I took an audible sigh, making sure that the Aurors heard it. You're right, Lord Ping, I suddenly responded, much to the audible gasps of about half the room, and a look of victory slowly forming upon the bull's punchable face. I have nothing of value to offer. See? The charlatan admits her, but humanity does, I interjected, stealing the wind right out of his sails, elaborating before he could get another word in. Because make no mistake, Lord Ping, I am not here on a journey of self-aggrandizement, nor a quest driven by personal betterment. I am here as a conduit, bearing the collective efforts of tens of thousands of brilliant minds behind me. I am here as a proxy, standing on the shoulders of 100 million giants that have collectively led me to where I am today. As a result, it was not me who offered the library a value proposition that led to this. I paused, taking a moment to tap the card against the composite of my armor, generating a series of satisfying metallic clinks in the process. It was the collective efforts of my people that resulted in this turnout. The room's reactions to my response was mixed, though most seemed too invested in the spectacle, rather than the worst to seemingly take sides just yet, as all waited to see where this would go. The bull's response was decidedly measured, yet dismissive all the same, as all he did was to simply chuff out an audibly loud scoff before proceeding on with yet another dismissive slight. So shall we add a misplaced sense of humility to the growing list of character deficits, Cadet Emma Booker? There was a pause at the end of that sentence, as if he somehow meant that as anything but a rhetorical question. It didn't last very long, however, for the bullish noble to move on, entering what was possibly the final inevitable stretch of his arguments. I believe it best that we end this charade once and for all. No more lies, no more deceits, no more posturing and mulling about. This whole situation has come about as a direct result of one object, and one object alone. As a result of this, I believe it's best if I take a closer look. He held out his hand, just a few feet short of me, as I looked down on it with an expressionless, unamused gaze. One that was actually translated well, given the default neutral expression of my helmet. I refused to respond, not wanting to play into his hand either way. But it was clear the large bully wasn't having it. Well, what say you, Cadet Emma Booker? No, I responded, with a loud, resounding denial, one that I'd purposely turned up the volume on for good measure. This clearly didn't faze the bull as he kept pushing regardless. What do you mean, no? No means no, Lord Ping. What little there was of whispers once again died down at this, as something shifted behind the bull's eyes. I couldn't tell exactly what, but I didn't need to. Not when the pupils of his eyes narrowed into pinpricks, and the white of his eyes started to go red. Does a commoner, a peasant, a child of the dirt dare to refuse and insult a noble of pure pedigree? The way he spoke, the way he carried each and every syllable, was just so different to what I'd been used to. Whilst the words were something I could have easily imagined coming out of Eleanor's mouth, the way it was delivered here was fundamentally different. The conviction in his voice, and just how objectively he worded everything, was just beyond what Eleanor, Thacia, Thaumin, or even Maltori had previously demonstrated. With the latter, It was a weird, lofty ideology, with wiggle room for political subterfuge and finagling. With Oris, it was zealotry. What's more, it was zealotry that wasn't tempered by Eleanor's scheming or Maotori's play at a bigger game. It was the pure, unadulterated deal. But that didn't change anything. I still wasn't going to back down. No, Lord Ping. And unless you want to talk this through, perhaps arrange a meeting at the library after this whole library blockade thing blows over. Then I'm afraid I will not be letting you lay your hands on my insolence! Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 230% above background radiation levels. Several things happened almost all at once. The first was a weird subtle pull forming around the card, still firmly lodged between my fingers, as if someone was attempting to slightly nudge it out of place. Or was this attempt at telekinetically ripping the card from my hands? No doubt. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 750% above background radiation levels. The second was what I could only describe as a sudden display of brilliant lights, so bright that it prompted the Eevee to automatically adjust for brightness, and accompanied by yet another mana radiation alert. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 750% above background radiation levels. The third was what amounted to a series of earth-shattering claps, as the ball that stood before me was suddenly and unceremoniously forced back with an inexplicable push, as if some invisible wave had thrown him back violently, without giving him a chance to even gain his bearings. A single second passed by when nothing at all happened, enough time for the ball to regain his senses, to stare back at me with a look of confusion, disbelief, and what was quickly becoming clear to me as panic. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 750% above background radiation levels. A panic that was definitely not misplaced, as the fourth distinct anomaly soon made itself known, in the form of a solid beam of energy aimed squarely at the ball. It was at this point that I was able to finally pinpoint the source of all of these sudden surges in mana, by simply tracing the beam of energy to its source. It was coming from my hands. Or more specifically, from the card I firmly held. The beam of energy made contact. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 400% above background radiation levels. But not before the ball managed to pull something off in the nick of time, generating a visible blue barrier that held for a second before it shattered into nothingness. That second was better than nothing, however, as it left his clothes and fur singed, but his body otherwise intact. The silence of the room was finally interrupted by a series of shocked gasps, yells, and a few distinct screams. The atmosphere of the entire space suddenly shifted on its axis, from one of tense anticipation throughout our verbal back and forths, to now a barely disguised state of panic. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 750% above background radiation levels. Yet as quickly as the yells, shrieks and screams came to dominate the echoey room, so too did other sounds suddenly gain traction. Sounds that resembled the fluttering of feathers, before evolving into the flapping of wings, and then, finally, morphing into what I could only describe as the rustling of the pages of several thousand books being flipped through all at once. These sounds, whilst loud and disorienting, seemed to only serve a single purpose. A purpose which became clear to me as it eventually died down, the moment Aura started to back away, becoming less and less audible the further the noble backed off. This eventually came to a head with a loud, threatening shriek, the unmistakable vocalization of an owl, before finally, the whole situation ended as confusingly and as abruptly as it began. I looked around, trying to see if the owl had manifested itself using the card as a proxy, but it was nowhere to be seen. The room once more fell into silence, as I was left standing there completely and utterly dumbfounded. To say that I was at a loss for words would be an understatement, as these magical shenanigans once more tested the absolute limits of my sanity. But with everything having just transpired, and with Orin having now well and truly backed off now, I was once more faced with a unique opportunity. One that tied back to the whole purpose of this tangent in the first place, proving a point. Except this time, it would be short and sweet, as these magical developments had already done all of the speaking for me. It was just up to me now, to tie it all back up in a neat little knot. A little knot that I realized could easily tie back to the events of the past few days. Let it be known that Earthrealm and its candidate does not take kindly to any attempts of thievery, and that we reserve the right to respond as we deem appropriate. I paused, taking a moment to hammer home a point, whose significance would only be realized between those in the know. I turned to face the Dean, before once more taking a page out of Quib's book, and addressed him with the most appropriate end cap to this whole act. I am a Booker, Cadet of the United Nations Armed Forces, and Patron of the Library. Defer the floor back to its rightful master. The Dean's reactions were nothing short of a complete and utter look of agonizing disdain, although his face didn't really read as such. Moreover, it was that same welcoming expression, accepting even. It was his eyes that did all the talking, and right now they were speaking a completely different language to the rest of his features. Indeed, they told a completely different story to what he was about to say, as he cleared his throat for a decorum-approved response. The floor recognizes this action, and recognizes the new title of one Cadet Emma Booker of Earthrealm, Patron of the Library. The whole room erupted in a newfound series of whispers. Wide-eyed surprise dominated their expressions, as did reactions that ranged anywhere from disheartened disgust, all the way to what I could only describe as apprehensive acknowledgement. What just happened? I don't know. The Earthrealmer performed a maneuver. Don't you mean New Realmer? When I think New Realm, I think sticks and stones or wooden hats. This isn't it. This doesn't sound like it. This doesn't look like it. So no, I'm sticking with Earthrealmer. She at least deserves this much for pulling this brazen stunt off. I concur. You lot are seriously considering humouring a commoner? A commoner with a library card? Let it be known that this isn't just any commoner. We may be dealing with a situation with a truly novel civilization. One with regressive sociological organization, but progressive acumen in other areas that actually matter. At least enough for the library to consider her worthy. You lot are insane. I concur. She's a one-trick pony is what she is. Exactly. Mark my words, she will not amount to anything. All of these whispers were eventually silenced. This time, however, not by the likes of the musical ensemble on stage, but by a raised hand from the recently defeated Oris. Yes, Lord Oris Ping, the floor is yours, the Dean spoke softly. Thank you, Professor Atalan Rurastor. I have but one final question, and a request within the pillars of expectant decorum. The Bull Noble paused, taking a moment to catch his breath before continuing. Professor, I call for disciplinary actions to be enforced upon the likes of this New Realmer. He spoke with a barely hidden rage just simmering underneath what remained of his polite sensibilities. I call upon the Academy to uphold its guarantees of the expectant rights and honours. Furthermore, I call upon the expectant Oath of the Guardian to enact swift retribution as reparations and in atonement for the damages incurred upon my honour and station. Audible gasps were heard among the faceless crowd and within the auditorium, as looks were exchanged between the seething Oris and the ever-calm and collected Dean. It only took a few seconds for the Dean to respond to this blatant request for vengeance, as a shiver ran up my spine upon realizing just how easily the situation could snowball if this went Oris's way. I steadied myself for what felt like the inevitable.
I am afraid the Honourable Lord Oris Ping has either been misinformed or has misconstrued the terms of the aforementioned oaths, rights, and honours, he began, garnering a look of abject shock from Oris as he continued unabated. The Academy cannot intervene in a feud between two independent parties, for it is within the honourable rights of the two parties to seek a mutually acceptable end to their quarrel. Moreover, the Honourable Lord Oris Ping has offered, on his own accord, the compromise of the Protector, has he not?
Indeed I have, Professor.
The compromise of the Protector bestows upon the voluntary party the full responsibilities of a given quarrel. This means the full repercussions are to be borne by the party in question, whether good or bad. This entire exchange is thus a matter exclusive to yourself and the New Realmer. Do you understand, Lord Oris Ping?
The bull visibly winced in place, as it was clear he wanted nothing more than to lash out, only to repress any rage he had with an unsatisfied sigh.
Yes, Professor.
What's more, the expectant oath of the Guardian does not extend to the damages incurred by parties outside of the Nexus and the adjacent realms. What you have just faced was the wrath of the Library, a party removed from traditional affairs. It is important not to misconstrue this, for the Earthrealm is slights against your honor, for the two are distinct and mutually exclusive. Now, with that being said, I suggest you leave post-haste to the infirmary.
Alert. Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 400% above background radiation levels.
A gargoyle statue from one of the many perches above the auditorium suddenly came to life, landing just shy of Oris's seat.
A gargoyle may escort you if you wish.
The bull quickly glanced back and forth between the gargoyle, the Dean, and the rest of his peer group.
Thank you, Professor Atalan Roristor. I defer the floor back to its rightful master.
The bull spoke, in the most resigned way I could have possibly imagined, before unceremoniously getting up and walking out of the auditorium. On the way out, I could practically feel his seething side-eye barreling down on me, but only for a few short moments, as he passed me without much else happening.
Now, if there are no other questions...
The Dean looked around as if daring anyone else to speak up. Unsurprisingly, nobody did, which prompted the man to bring the whole thing to a satisfying conclusion.
I hereby conclude this ceremony. Dismissed!